Stacey D. Stewart is the U.S. President for United Way Worldwide. Stacey is responsible for leading the U.S. network of nearly 1,200 local and state United Ways to create opportunities for a better life for all. Stacey leads multiple teams responsible for creating change to improve the lives through the areas of education, financial stability, and health. Under Stacey's leadership, the U.S. network engages thousands of local partners and over 9 million individual donors and volunteers, and raises over $3.9 billion each year to rally around initiatives in these vital areas. Stacey actually has a very deep background in terms of her history. Before becoming U.S. President of United Way Worldwide, she was the Executive Vice President for Community Impact Leadership and Learning, and she was also with the Fannie Mae Foundation and Merrill Lynch. Stacey has a Master's of Business Administration degree in Finance from the University of Michigan, not very far from the Canadian border, and a Bachelor of Arts in Economics from Georgetown University. She also holds a number of honorary degrees from Trinity Washington University, Morgan State University, Texas Southern University, Lincoln University, and Alabama A&M. And she also is quite involved on a number of advisory councils. So, Stacey, thanks so much for joining us today on this call.
Well, it's great to be with you. Thanks for inviting me, and look forward to the conversation today.
I'd like to, before we dive into our questions, Stacey, I just want to let people know about your upcoming presentation at our Collective Impact Summit in Vancouver in September, at the end of September, early October. We're very pleased that you've agreed to be our kickoff keynote speaker, and you're actually going to be speaking to the theme possible when the improbable becomes the inevitable, and we're going to talk about that a little bit later in this conversation. So we'll just give people a little bit of an hors d'oeuvre about the Collective Impact Summit and get back to that question a little bit later on.
That sounds great.
So let's dive into our first question, Stacey. So the question is really about collective impact. How did collective impact come to be on your radar, and why did you decide to make it a focus of United Way Worldwide and the learning and annual conferences that you've had?
Well, it's a really good question. I came to United Way Worldwide in 2009 after experiences of working in communities all around the country on affordable housing, and then going very deep on a broad spectrum of issues affecting people living in the District of Columbia and the quality of life of the District of Columbia. And I actually came to United Way because of the experiences I had in trying to move the needle on some really tough issues, whether it was around affordable housing or public education or health access. And realized then, as the president and CEO of the Fannie Mae Foundation, that in order to make real progress on community metrics and in ways that are both systemic and sustainable, that it really it went beyond often what capacity and capability we brought as one institution, that only some of these things could be addressed when there was a much more of a collective, aligned approach that is driven by real data and metrics, and where there's a significant degree of community will to act. And when I got a call to consider coming to United Way Worldwide, the one organization that I always knew that had the capability, the relationships, the respect, the trust, the broad spectrum of relationships across sectors that could sort of convene and galvanize whole communities around any issue, was United Way. That had been always my experience in my career, knowing of United Way as a board member, as a funder, and just living in communities with strong United Ways. And so when I came to United Way and sort of looked at how United Way was even looking at itself at the time, with almost a 125-year history, it was pretty clear to see that United Way had, over the course of its history, been that entity that often was serving at sort of the crux, or at the as sort of the glue in many cases for community to bring various sectors and partners together to focus on improving lives. And that certainly had been what United Ways had been doing, and certainly it was clear to me that United Ways could play an even greater role, an even more powerful and impactful leadership role in that way. And so I made it a point when I came here to sort of build out what that role could look like, and how it could be aligned with community priorities, how United Ways could listen and learn from others, how we could partner well together. And we certainly had a lot of great partnerships that were beginning or already in place by the time I got here, with other organizations that were sort of in this space as well, folks like Ready by 21, FSG, Living Cities, Strive together. There were a lot of folks we could sort of look to that would help us understand the role that United Ways could play to sort of take on a backbone role, really think about collective approaches across communities. And so it's through these sort of partnerships and tools, and just the way that we had already been positioned, it made it possible for us to think about how to evolve in this whole area of collective impact, which really we weren't even talking about as a term back in 2009. It really got coined as a term, I think, sometime after that. But it certainly was very much in sync with a lot of things that we were seeing at United Way that we could, help communities make progress on, and a way of thinking about ourselves and working with others that seemed to align with what people wanted in communities, and have been wanting in terms of community solutions for some time now. So I think it's both rooted in our history and just how we now see ourselves in terms of how to solve community challenges that often are very vexing and complicated and require extensive collective work.
That's really interesting. I think you're right about that. I think United Ways are uniquely positioned in communities because they see kind of a broad spectrum of the community. So, and I think that is really important in terms of collective approaches and working towards community change. How is the United Way U.S. network using a collective impact approach now to create change? On the three key areas that I mentioned when I read your bio really quickly, the three key areas of focus: education, financial stability, and health. So if you could, give us a little bit more information about those three areas and the role that United Way is playing, that would be great.
Yeah, sure. So I think it's fair to say that, with almost between 1,100 and 1,200 United Ways around the United States, it certainly, and I know this would be the observation that a lot of folks on this webinar would have about United Way, is that the way United Ways look in communities can vary quite dramatically across the country. And United Ways, based on the community conditions, based on the capacity within the United Way, based on the leadership that the community wants from its United Way, the United Way can play, very different roles. A lot of how United Ways have been traditionally known in communities is really much more as a community fundraising organization, raising money and then deploying those resources to really worthy programs, and investing in worthy organizations that are doing great work. A lot of United Ways that had been working in that space for a while began to understand and see the changes and feel the sort of changes in philanthropic giving and how people were coming together around community solutions, and began to adapt to their own community needs, the leadership that some communities wanted from its United Way, and have adapted their models over time to one that's more in the space of collective impact, as we're now referring to it. For a long period of our history, especially as we began to focus on measuring results, not just in terms of the amount of money raised, but in terms of how much we're making a difference in community issues, we began to really define our work and impact as being very much focused on supporting those building blocks for a good life. These are building blocks that we think of as being sort of almost universal, not just in the U.S. but around the world. The things that people need in order just to ensure that they can fulfill on their greatest potential for their lives. And those three things tend to be getting access to a good education, having access to good income and the ability to become financially stable over time, and also having access to good health care and access to health and wellness and avoiding risky behavior. I won't get into a lot of detail about this, but back in 2008, the United Way in the U.S. set some pretty ambitious goals or aspirations in those three areas. But I would say in education, income, and health, those are our three areas that become the primary focus for the community impact work that we try to focus on at United Way across the country. Again, the model and how we fulfill on those that work and how we accomplish that work may vary, but those are essentially the three main areas. Where we see United Way is making a lot of progress in those areas is when they are taking on a much more aligned approach, working across sector, galvanizing and serving as sort of the glue or the backbone for a collective approach to some meaningful outcomes that create real systemic change in communities. And just some examples of what that looks like today are in each of those areas, in education and financial stability and health. One example I'll mention is in the education space, and that is in some cases, and in a lot of cases now, increasingly so, our partnership with Strive Together, where we, with local United Ways and Strive Together, have begun to really go deeply into the collective impact models around cradle-to-career advances to help ensure that young people have an opportunity early in life until early adulthood to succeed, especially in education. One of the great examples of this is one in Albuquerque, New Mexico. It's called Mission Graduate, where they focus on ensuring that there are an additional 60,000 new graduates with college degrees or certifications in central New Mexico by 2020. And that's a very collective approach between education leaders and other government leaders, university leaders as well, those in higher ed, public school leaders, parents, teachers, schools, especially focusing on the diverse community in Albuquerque and making sure that there's an opportunity for success, cradle to career. It also ensures that employers are at the table to make sure that as kids are receiving an education that they're adequately serving as a prepared workforce and building a prepared workforce in central New Mexico for the employers that are there. And in fact, this effort has really invited central New Mexico employers to commit to collecting data, to making sure that that the work that's being done in Mission Graduate is also producing the kinds of future employees that employers are seeking. In the health area, we've got some great examples, and a lot of these examples aren't all from our largest United Ways, and that's another issue we may come back to. We have some smaller and medium-sized United Ways that are doing some incredibly innovative kinds of work. There's an initiative in Santa Cruz, California called Go for Health, which is working hard on addressing childhood obesity through a very collective approach. One interesting little tidbit there is that they've even brought in a collaboration with the Santa Cruz Transit Board of Directors with restaurants and others to set a collective goal to reduce obesity by at least 10% by 2020, and they're actively working across sector to accomplish that goal. Probably the one in the health area that has received the most attention is the one is our work with our United Way in Greater Milwaukee and Waukesha County around reducing teen pregnancy. Several years ago, Milwaukee showed up as one of the cities with the highest rates of teen pregnancy, and it was really an issue that galvanized the community, the mayor, public health officials, and others asked the United Way if they would play a convening role to pull in all of the right players that would kind of begin to solve this issue. This wasn't sort of a tolerable outcome for young people in Milwaukee that the leaders of Milwaukee were satisfied with. And so many years ago, the city set a goal to reduce Milwaukee's teen pregnancy rate by at least 45% in 10 years. Well, they achieved that goal in probably 6 years or more, and are still working hard to continue to reduce that rate. They've now teen births have actually dropped by 56% since 2006 in Milwaukee, and the initiative is a great success. A couple quick notes on that. They brought in incredible media partners to build public awareness about the issue, so it wasn't just a big programmatic initiative. This was really, again, an activity in building civic will and collective will across the community. They brought in employers and corporate partners who began to see how public health care costs. We're also increasing their employee health care costs and therefore impacting their bottom line. So everyone in the community began to see how the teen pregnancy rate was actually impacting them either institutionally or individually, and had a vested interest in becoming a part of the solution. We've got other examples in financial stability, a great partnership with Wells Fargo that's bringing in United Ways across the country to focus on financial stability. One of the United Ways that we are seeing a lot of promise from is our United Way Central Iowa, which is a part of the Wells Fargo partnership, but is working very collaboratively across sector on workforce development programs that are bringing employers and workers, public and private partners together to close the skills gap and advance pathways to careers for individuals. So we've got a lot of really great examples in all of these areas. The last thing I'll just say is that while one of the things that we're acknowledging right now with our work in education, income, and health is that those issues are not siloed off to themselves. In other words, if we're working on the issue of education, for example, helping kids read on grade level by the end of third grade, helping kids graduate from high school, the strategies and the approaches and even the cross-sector partners have to be diverse and collective as well. So we may be shooting for a real outcome in terms of helping all kids read on grade level by the end of third grade, but we also know that if kids aren't healthy, then they're not going to be able to succeed in school. And so we have to have pediatricians at the table with us as we're working on an education outcome. We also know that kids are not going to learn if their families are not financially stable, and therefore workforce providers and employers, education, higher education leaders have to be at the table to make sure that adults are able to receive the kinds of job training and preparation they need to advance in their careers and increase their incomes so they can stabilize their lives and the lives of their families. So in other words, even when we're really focused on a big community-wide outcome in either education, income, or health, it requires the integration of all three of those things to accomplish even one of those big goals. And that's a very interesting part of where we're taking the work as we move forward.
That's very interesting, and it actually speaks to my next question, which is, really some of the lessons that you've learned at United Way Worldwide, and particularly in the U.S. around the collective impact work that has been going on. You've given us some really great examples about Milwaukee and Santa Cruz and some of the work that you're doing with Strive Together. So what are some of those other lessons that you've learned? The integration you've spoken to already, but what are some of the other lessons you learned, Stacey, as you've been venturing down this path?
Great question. So I think the one thing that we kind of center our work in collective impact around almost as a starting point, as a necessary building block, is this idea that if a United Way is going to play a leadership role in helping to advance a big community-wide outcome and convene and galvanize a lot of different players and sectors to be at the table, then it better be the issue that people think is really most critical. I mean, the Milwaukee example I gave you was something that is a good example of that. It wasn't as if the United Way just anointed itself the backbone for that work and decided to tell or mandate to the community what it should be focused on. It was really a priority that rose up, built up from within the community for lots of people who decided that there needed to be alignment in the community around this one particular issue, and there the United Way could step in and sort of help move that issue along and play an important leadership role to serve the community's interests and priorities. I would say that at the centerpiece of our collective impact work, it is very much around the kind of engagement in communities that we think is essential for United Way is to both listen to communities, respond to those priorities, and really serve the interests and be the steward of community, not steward like me, but steward of community priorities, so that the United Way is actively acting on the priorities that the community has said it cares about, not necessarily what the United Way has imposed on the community. So just to that end, I will just mention that we've had a very deep and long-term relationship with the Harwood Institute, and I know there are many folks in Canada and across the U.S. that have been working very closely with the Harwood Institute on this way of community engagement, turning outward, and really listening to the community's priorities and interests and letting that dictate the agenda and letting that drive the engagement that the community that's going to be required from the community in order for action to be taken. So I think that's the first step that we've learned. It also, as a backbone organization, has given us a lot of room to be able to move things forward when we can honestly reflect and authentically reflect on what the community says is a priority, as opposed to, again, speaking from it from an institutional standpoint that if the United Way says, the community has said these are its priorities, it's a much more powerful statement than if we just say that these are our priorities alone at United Way. So that's the first step. I think the second step is that we've learned two things. One is that as a backbone organization, we can't anoint ourselves to serve in that role. It's got to be something that the community has said. We really want our United Way to play a convening role, to help organize us, to help pull us together in this community. We respect and have trust in the United Way's leadership capability to play that role, and we're asking the United Way to step up in that way. And also, when the United Way does serve in that role, I think what's really important is that backbone organizations, at least for us, learn very skillfully how not to take credit for all the work of all the partners who are at the table. It's very important that the United Way's brand be put in line with the contributions and the other things that partners are bringing to the partnership that are creating real results. And so helping United Ways understand how to give and take and share credit whenever possible is really important to keep people at the table over the long haul, and recognizing those joint contributions. An example of this really is our United Way of San Diego has been doing a lot of work in this cradle to career space, and again working with Strive Together. And there were several times that members of the leadership table commented on how great the partnership is, because because the partnership gave full credit to focusing on all that everyone was doing to improve lives, instead of United Way just taking credit for all that was done, and that was something that the partners very much appreciated. I think the other thing is kind of supporting partners and thinking and acting differently about this more beneficial process. I mean, there's one of the challenges that we see is that partners think of this partnership as another program rather than really a broad process or effort in community change and community will building. This work isn't like another initiative. When in Milwaukee, when the community galvanized around changing teen pregnancy, it was way beyond funding a program or funding an initiative. This was about really changing the behavior, creating normative change in behavior and values in the city that got adopted across the city, and where partners really wanted to advance an agenda because they saw that it was in the interest of all of the city, not just a few. And so that's another thing. I mean, there's a basis of a lot of this work in collective impact for us. It goes back to that community engagement point I made, which feels a lot like community organizing, and it feels a lot like building the will to act, changing the civic competence of a community, and it goes well beyond just the words program and initiative don't seem to feel right when you're talking about this work. It has a feeling that those terms are too limiting in terms of describing what this work really looks like on the ground. All of our partner organizations, that we work with have their own culture and their lens, and we have to honor what everyone brings to the table. And all the partner organizations that we work with locally, think intentionally about how to join a table with us and us with them, and sort of creating this integrated and committed approach. And I think that's kind of a lot of what we've learned, over the last several years, for sure.
I think those are really powerful lessons that we can all take away from this conversation in terms of, whether we're a United Way partner or whether we're a community partner in terms of collective impact approaches. So let's get into the nuts and bolts of United Ways. We know that United Ways play multiple roles in community, including being a funder, an allocator of resources, and a convener often of collective impact tables. How does a collective impact approach help facilitate these different roles that a United Way typically plays in a community?
Yeah, this is where it can be a little bit tricky, I think, sometimes. I would say that, I had an experience before I even came to United Way at the Fannie Mae Foundation. We were the largest foundation in D.C., and we tried to turn our attention from some of the root causes of some of the affordable housing challenges we were seeing, and we found, obviously, that a lot of the challenges we were finding in terms of serving an adult population where 40% of the adults could read at no higher than the third grade level, that a lot of the reasons we were having challenges gaining momentum and building traction on the affordable housing issue was because we were trying to serve a population that was lacked the capacity to even access minimum wage jobs, needed such great deep subsidy that we were not going to be able to meet our goals in affordable housing without dealing with the challenges of really an unprepared adult population to access better paying jobs and access more market rate housing. And so I'm just giving this example to say that I think a lot of, we got started on kind of galvanizing and convening the community around public education and bringing in different sectors, not because we were the education expert, but because we had a lot of influence in the city as the city's largest funder, and that brought a lot of folks to the table. And I think that's just one of the sort of elephants in the room that I think that a lot of organizations and institutions that have great influence in the city can often be looked to be the conveners. But I do think it takes more than just that to be a really adequate backbone organization, and sometimes being the funder can be very confusing with also being the backbone organization. So for United Ways, what we've had to do is really understand, how do you not just operate, for those that have moved into this collective impact space, how do you not just be a big funder of efforts that are important in a community, but then bring in and convene and invite other players, even those partners that we may not be funding, and include them at the table. In other words, to be a backbone organization around the issue of education, we might not be funding the public school system the way we may be funding other nonprofit partners that are providing supports to kids K through 12, but the public school system still is a necessary partner that has to be at the table. So we have to really show ourselves to be more than just a funder, but to really be a collaborative leader, and aligning all of the various strategies, research-based strategies that need to be in place to see meaningful change across the community, align not only our financial investments with those kinds of things that are necessary, but also align particular strategies and actions with the partners that also have to be at the table as well, and convene them and engage them and build relationships with them just as much as anyone else. So that's the first thing. I think the other thing is that something I mentioned before, which is, when we make big mistakes, I think sometimes when we confuse that we're really first and foremost having to prioritize the community's agenda, which may or may not always align with the United Way's own organizational agenda, but it is something that we have to remind ourselves to be an effective backbone, is that it is about putting the community's agenda first and building that trust and maintaining that trust over time. We had an example in Spokane, our United Way in Spokane, that really was able to define the work, what they worked on, and align it around the partnership's goals and use that as a guidepost. So they basically brought their work in line with the community, and in fact that actually made their other work easier because they had much more alignment with what they were trying to do and what the community's priorities were. There are a lot of United Ways that play the role of kind of change agent with other funders. We have some United Ways that are working with other investors to kind of influence how others channel their resources. And I think that's a big sign of success in a collective approach, is when other funders are willing to come to the table, and when we're able to influence how other resources become aligned with the collective approach. I think that's a big thing that we've learned how to do better, and play that role of change agent influencing other funders as well. At the end of the day, what we've learned is that we've got to bring all of our relationships across the board, nonprofit, public, and private relationships, and bring them into greater synergy to address community problems. I mean, United Way, one of the things that makes us so special is we're one of the few organizations that has labor leaders and corporate leaders on the board. We have community nonprofit leaders and government leaders, and the real asset in that is when we can bring those partners together to think about an aligned community-wide approach, and influence those players to think first about community's interests first, and allow their own institutional or parochial interests to fall behind, just as we have to model as well. So, I mean, those are some of the things that I think have worked for us and are continuing to work as we make progress on this model.
Yeah, I think, for me, one of the important lessons learned in what you've just said, Stacey, is that we need to acknowledge, the important role that United Way does play in terms of influence across the community, right, and the ability to bring people of influence in a collective impact context to the table. I think that that's a really, really critical role. We've got a couple of minutes left for our conversation, and then and we're going to address some of the questions that people posed, when we asked them to pose questions in the email. But I want to just spend a few minutes talking about your leadership in terms of the creation and implementation of United Way's U.S. policy agenda and advocacy platform. Where do you see the greatest opportunities for change and impact in that work?
So I think we see the policy and advocacy work we do as being very much integrated into this idea that what we're really focused on long term is systemic change. And at the end of the day, we think that this collective approach and all the collective approaches we're involved in have to have a strong basis on data, and that the decisions that we make are informed by what the research says works and whether or not we're actually achieving real results, and can report out on progress that we're making. Just to go back to the Milwaukee example, I mean, they made it a practice to track data and metrics on the progress they were making on the efforts they were working on across the community. They made it a point of making sure the community was aware of that progress, made it very public and visible, very transparent, and could track with the community the reduction in teen pregnancy year in and year out, and kept the community very well informed about what was working and how to make progress, and bringing other kinds of, what's proven to work in other communities into the decision-making process, so that things really became a collective approach where there really were mutually reinforcing activities, things that were being done in the schools complemented things that were being done by other partners, for example. And so relying on data, relying on research, relying on metrics, being very transparent, and using that data to communicate a message is one of the ways that we've seen a lot of momentum be built in communities. Even when progress isn't being made, it informs a conversation, because then people can adjust strategies or adjust the approaches to try to see if better results can be achieved. But when we look at the systemic change, again, at the end of the day, if we've seen progress being made, then if we can take that to policymakers and try to sort of embed that in legislative change and other kind of policy change, we think that that is ultimately the success that builds for long-term improvement in communities over time. And we certainly have built out, and I oversee our public policy work here at United Way Worldwide, focusing largely on federal policy changes. We had a very active policy agenda preparation process here at Worldwide. We work very, very closely with local United Ways to build our public policy agenda. We encourage local United Ways to not just support us on federal policy change, but to be very active in state and local policy change as well in all of these areas, in education and financial stability and health. In education, we've had a very robust policy agenda looking at how to promote more high-quality integrated early learning systems, how to promote better coordination between early education and the K through 12 systems, how to align public and private and philanthropic investments around early learning. We have lots of United Ways working very, very deeply in establishing early warning and response systems, and are working very hard to figure out if there's a way to create more systemic approaches to collecting data for at-risk kids to make sure that we can capture those kids early and create more targeted interventions to support kids who are most at risk. We certainly do this in the context of working with broad-based coalitions. We try not to go alone in this work, so we work very, very closely with government and local education agencies, nonprofits, others in the nonprofit sector to advocate collectively for policy approaches that make sense. Sometimes we lead those coalitions, sometimes we don't, and we're happy when we can support others who are taking much more of a public leadership role. The last thing I'll just say is that we very much try to make sure that we target our policy resources very carefully. So we actually create a tiered approach to priority issues that we think are most important, and again, even collectively try to work with others to make a difference, both on the Hill in Washington and then across the country as well.
It's really interesting. Canada is going to a federal election, as you are in the United States as well. So are there resources on the United Way Worldwide website that if folks want to dive into this a little bit more deeply that they can access?
Well, we certainly have our policy agenda. I think I'm confident is available on our website, unitedway.org. And we have a team of folks here led by Steve Taylor who would be more than happy to follow up with folks if they're interested in getting a more in-depth understanding of how we go about our policy work. We can certainly connect folks to the resources we have here at Worldwide. And certainly as we go through our policy agenda development into the next year, would love to engage local United Ways in our network around the development of that and engage outside partners as well.
Great, thanks, Stacey. So our final question is, we're thrilled that you're going to be joining us at the Collective Impact Summit at the end of September. The theme is possible when the improbable becomes the inevitable, and I think the responses that you've already given us during the course of this call have actually addressed this notion of possible. But what do you see? Where do you see the greatest opportunities for change and impact? Oh, sorry. I went to the wrong question. Can you give us a hint as to what you'll share with us in Vancouver?
Yeah, sure. Probably go into more depth on some of the things I've already talked about today, but I do think it is going into more depth and describing exactly how, at least from a United Way perspective, we see galvanizing a community across the board, across sector, towards really large-scale change. How we've been able to and how we're working hard to try to figure out how to move from just purely institutional partnerships to kind of really building coalitions of individuals and organizations. At United Way, we have over 9 million people who give to United Way. I mean, there's a real opportunity that if we get those people not only to give to United Way, but to take action around things in the community collectively that people care about. If there's a way that those interests that everyday people have can somehow align with the priorities of other institutional partners in community, there's just such a powerful role that United Way can play to actually help communities understand their common aspirations and where there is a common feeling across the board that certain priorities need broad scale attention and investment of time and effort and resources. How we then craft agendas that align with those aspirations and engage people, everyday people and institutions, and align them in terms of their collective efforts together. And then how do we scale it? I mean, we love to talk about Milwaukee or Salt Lake City or Santa Cruz, California, but our goal, my goal here, is how do we scale this change so that it's we see the lift not only in individual local communities, but across the entire country in the U.S. and eventually where United Ways exists around the world. So that's certainly our aspiration, and would love to share more about our thinking in Vancouver. Excited to be there, and certainly appreciate the invitation to join you all in September.
Yeah, we're very excited to have you, Stacey. So we've come to the end of the formal part of the interview, and so thanks for that. For those of you that have been listening in and have some questions that you might want to pose to Stacey, I'd love to invite you to type your questions into the chat box. As I mentioned at the beginning of the call, we have a number of questions that were submitted in advance, and we've only got about 10 or so minutes left. So maybe what I'll do as you're considering your questions, I'll pose one or two of the questions and have Stacey respond to some of the questions that were submitted in advance. And I'll maybe start, Stacey, with this first question, which comes from one of the folks that registered for the call. Do you have any advice about how to engage our local United Way when the entire community is mobilizing behind collective impact, but the United Way may seem slightly disinterested?
So good question, and I think that goes to the point I was making earlier, is that while we've seen a lot of United Ways playing a much more active role in collective impact, even playing a backbone role often, it won't be true for every single United Way in every community, and that may be for a variety of reasons. It could be that the United Way may feel as though it doesn't have the capacity or the capability to take on this much more ambitious leadership role. I mean, frankly, it is a leadership role that requires a good amount of resources. If a backbone organization is going to start to collect data and analyze data and have a communications vehicle to help communicate out things, to engage and convene community players, it requires a lot of resources, and it requires a lot of time and attention from the executive director or the CEO, and then throughout the staff. And so the disinterestedness may not be just being disinterested. It may be just concerns with the United Way may have of being too overwhelmed with the role that the community might want the United Way to play, and so I think that's a conversation that can be held with the United Way. Some United Ways, this is new and different work for them, and there are sometimes United Ways who feel like maybe they've not advanced in their own community impact work to be able to lead in this particular way. And in that case, it may or may not make sense for a United Way to serve as the backbone role, or to step up and play a more active role in sort of helping to mobilize the community. It could be another organization that does that, and I think that has to be okay. I certainly think it ought to be the organization that the community trusts and feels is capable of doing it, as well as the organization feeling like they have the capacity as well to not disappoint and not help the community fulfill on its aspirations. And I think creating that match is going to be really important. But it certainly is our goal here to help United Ways understand that when they can and when they want to, when their communities want them to play that role, it certainly is our job here to help ensure that they have the resources and support they need to help ensure their position in the right way. And that's what we try to do here at United Way Worldwide.
Well, I think the point that you raised in your response, Stacey, is the importance of engaging in a conversation about, what role, and to really look at the variety of different roles that a United Way could play, in helping to advance the collective impact effort, right? It doesn't necessarily always have to be the backbone. There might be other roles in terms of, supporting the data mobilization part of the work, or being a community champion. So there's a whole bunch of different roles that United Ways can play.
And that's right. And so we've had a lot of United who play the funder role, funding the backbone organization that takes on this work. We've also had situations where another organization stepped up to be the backbone, and it didn't work, and the United Way picked up the work from there. So if the United Way is not playing that role today, just hang on for a little bit. Maybe they'll come around a little while after. But it is definitely a local decision. Local partners have to come together and make decisions. It's in the best interest of the community.
Yeah, and one of the things that we've seen in Canada, I don't know if you've seen it in the United States, where funders have stepped up and played the backbone role, we've seen them do that for a period of time and then move away and say, now it's time for someone else to play the role of backbone, right? So we've seen some of the movement, particularly in some of the poverty reduction roundtables across Canada, where backbones aren't, you're not a backbone forever, that you might move away from the table, as you've just said, and then allow others to move into that, providing those backbone supports as well.
That's exactly right. And then also shared backbone rules. I mean, in Cincinnati, our United Way in Cincinnati with the Strive model there, it plays, is one of a few backbones there on that cradle to career. So there are multiple ways this can work. There's not only one model that works for a community.
Yeah, and I think it really is, based on the local community context, as you so rightly have pointed out. So a couple of questions around common agenda. One question asked about how do you get buy-in from different players, and then the second question asked about accountability for the shared or common agenda. And I think that those two questions are kind of tied in together. So wonder if you might be able to just give us some thoughts about that the common agenda, and you've spoken to it a little bit in the question and answer part, or the main part of this webinar, but that's always I think the most challenging early stage part of this work, is getting agreement on the common agenda.
Well, one of the things that I think a lot of United Ways sometimes come into this thinking and feeling like, well, we've already got a lot of work, we're already well invested in our education work or income work or health work, and we need to bring more partners on board with this. And I think there certainly is, if the United Way has the ability to convene and convince people of the priority that the United Way is already working on, and can get interest and commitment and excitement by a lot of partners to be a part of something, that's great. I think one of the things, because United Ways have been doing work for a long period of time, it's not as if the movie just starts today and we get to scrap everything we've ever done and start over. So I think it is practical to say, where are we in our community work so far, and how do we advance and make progress on the things that we're working on. And that's where we've asked United Ways to take an opportunity at whatever point they're at to say, let's go back to the community and engage them and find out what their priorities are, what their aspirations are. It provides an opportunity to determine where there may be a lot of alignment in the community, but it just may not be bubbling up, so that people are sharing those common aspirations and realizing how much people have in common with each other. And that's where United Way's role is, as using some of these the hardwood tools that I've talked about, and really engaging with the community and really listening to what the community cares about. And that's across the board, not just everyday people, but community leaders and across sector. Really getting a good sense of what the community cares about is a great way to bring that forward publicly and say, when we talk to the community across the board, here's what we've heard overwhelmingly. I'm just making this up, but here's what we've heard as the leading priorities in this community. If that's true, can we come together to start working more in alignment with each other about what goals and aspirations we'd want to act on together, and can we put in place a way for everyone to be at the table and see themselves as being a part of the solution. So I think that's a great starting point, is to again listen authentically to the community, bring forward to the community very publicly what we've heard. And we've actually had United Ways do public meetings to report out on the community conversations that they've had. We did one nationally, actually, pulling up from about 40 United Ways what lots of communities were talking about and here are saying that they cared about in education. We did that nationally a few years ago. So there's a way to bring all that forward in ways that galvanize people's interest and where people see, wow, we have more in common with each other. Let's get going on working on something together. The last thing I'll just say is, I think the media and can be a very powerful friend in this. What we saw in Milwaukee when the headlines hit about Milwaukee's high teen pregnancy rate, there was no more powerful galvanizer of action than seeing your city being at the top of the list in terms of teen pregnancy rates. And it caused people to want to say, this does not reflect who we are. We see ourselves and have an aspiration for ourselves as a different city, and that got people to act in a different way. So I think that kind of building public awareness and understanding of the priorities, but the common interests that may actually exist that no one's really talking about is a powerful way that a United Way or any organization can sort of bring to the forefront, build a compelling case for people to come together differently, to act differently, and then to embark on a journey of fulfilling on a community's aspirations.
I think that's some really great advice. The final question that I think I'll end on, and I think you spoke to it again in the main portion of this webinar, because United Way Worldwide, and particularly in the United States, has so many local partners. You mentioned this, that rural and urban, the question was around, does rural and urban make a difference, right? Are collective impact approaches more successful in an urban environment versus a rural environment?
That's a very interesting question. I think one of the things I mentioned earlier is that we often see some of the greatest traction on collective impact happening in not the biggest urbanized communities in the U.S. and also not the very smallest ones. It's often in these medium-sized communities that have kind of just enough resources to bring to the table to get some things done, but where the backbone organization and then the participating individuals and institutions have the strongest relationships with each other. They know each other well. They've been working with each other and have the opportunity to come together and make progress differently together. Salt Lake City, Santa Cruz, California. I mean, these communities are Milwaukee is not a New York City or a Chicago, but it's a big city, but it's not the largest, most complex cities in the country. And so one of the things that we found is that sometimes it's where there are relationships that exist that can be leveraged. Hopefully not too much baggage with those relationships, but good relationships that can be can be sort of galvanized and taken it fully leveraged to move people in a direction. With institutions that are sort of staples in the community and people have trust and have a great deal of have a reputation for working within communities, that's where we often see the most traction. I actually think in small communities and maybe even in rural communities, even though some of those communities can be very spread out, the people in rural communities can, often know each other. I mean, they work with each other, they do business with each other, they've been a part of those communities for a long, long time often, and that can often be the making of, a really successful collective approach. In some cases, in our largest communities, while it is absolutely possible, some of our largest United Ways have to think about community-wide change very differently. Sometimes they look at it not across an entire community, but in New York City, maybe borough by borough, or maybe let's start in particular neighborhoods or areas of the city before we go citywide or community-wide. And so in some of the more complex communities, it is entirely possible for this approach to work, tons of resources to be brought to the table, but it just requires a very sophisticated kind of leadership style to bring a lot of different players to the table and deal with the scale of the challenges that often those communities face. So it can work in any scenario, but I do think there are some things that are sort of ready-made to make some of these things go faster than in some communities than in others.
Great, thanks, Stacey. I think what you've observed is similar to what we've observed in Canada as well. That it does work in all contexts, but it is more challenging in really large cities. In our case, like Toronto, it's a bit more of a challenge. But certainly, United Way of Greater Toronto has done some amazing work at a neighborhood level as well. So thanks, Stacey, for joining us today for today's broadcast and for sharing your considerable expertise with us and your thoughts and reflections on how the United Way Worldwide is embracing collective impact. I'd also like to thank all the others that have joined us on the call for the questions that you sent in advance. I didn't see too many come up in the chat box, but we have a number of questions that we weren't able to get to, and so we want to thank you for both participating on the call today and also for sending those questions. In a few days, Tamarack will email you with links to the audio and other material related to today's call. If you have any comments at all, please email us at tamarackcommunity.ca to let us know what you thought about today's broadcast, and maybe we can move ahead a slide and so that they have the email address on the slide. Oh, maybe one more. Stacey, as you all know, will be a keynote speaker at the Collective Impact Summit in Vancouver this September. We do hope you'll join us there to access the latest thinking on collective impact. We also have a webinar coming up later this month with Mark Cabage. He's another one of our summit keynote speakers, and that webinar, which will be held on August 20th, is on evaluating collective impact, 5 simple rules, and you can get more information on both the Collective Impact Summit and other learning events that are being sponsored by Tamarack at www.tamarackcommunity.ca. We have some space still available at the Collective Impact Summit, so if those of you on the call are intrigued in hearing more from Stacey, we welcome you to go onto the website and register. And with that, we're at the end of our time for today. So thanks everybody for joining us again, and have a great day. And we will chat with many of you again on August 20th when we talk to Mark Cabage. Bye-bye, everybody.